The vast and imposing marble columns that held up the grand hearing chamber of the Supreme Court cast long shadows over the proceedings, adding an air of gravity and timeless authority to the room. As the session unfolded, Justice Samuel Alo leaned forward slightly, his posture reflecting both attentiveness and a controlled sense of disapproval. His facial expression was carefully guarded, a mask of composed disdain that revealed nothing yet hinted at underlying firmness. Opposite him, standing confidently at the podium, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who, with her striking appearance, drew immediate attention. Her bright red blazer, a vivid splash of color amid the subdued wooden paneling, contrasted sharply with the surroundings, emphasizing her presence and determination. Her demeanor was calm, measured, but undeniably resolute, and what transpired next would prove to be a moment of shock and revelation for everyone present. Crockett began to speak with a steady, unwavering voice that carried the weight of conviction, clear and firm, almost like steel in its resilience. Before delving into her arguments, she decided to start with a quotation, something she found particularly compelling that would serve as a potent opening. She paused deliberately, allowing the tension to build, her gaze directly fixed on Justice Alo, establishing an unspoken challenge. Her words sliced through the silence. "These are not merely my words, but yours." With deliberate movement, she retrieved a document from her folder, holding it up under the bright courtroom lights so everyone could see. Its pages crisp and clean, a tangible testament to the seriousness of this moment. A subtle change flickered across Justice Alo's face. Perhaps it was curiosity, or a cautious recognition that something significant was unfolding. His brow furrowed momentarily, a faint crease forming between his eyebrows, signaling a shift in his composure. Crockett proceeded to read aloud a statement she had extracted from his own previous writings, emphasizing the words carefully. "The Constitution makes no mention of abortion, and no such right is implicitly protected by any constitutional provision." She pointed out that this was his stance in a case known as Dobbs, illustrating his firm opinion at the time on the matter. She allowed the statement to linger in the air, as if testing the room's reaction, then pressed on, highlighting a stark contrast. She observed that, despite his clarity on that issue, he had applied a notably different standard when assessing other rights that aligned with his personal views, evidence of a selective approach that seemed inconsistent with his earlier assertions. Her words drew sharp murmurs from the audience, whispers rippling through the chamber, as Justice Alo's face flushed red with unease. The tension escalated. Even the Chief Justice, noticing the rising noise, instinctively reached for his gavel to restore order. Yet, before he could speak, Crockett continued, saying, "What happens when a justice's own words become their greatest vulnerability? We are about to discover." This was no ordinary congressional hearing. It was transforming into a dramatic confrontation poised to shake the foundation of the Supreme Court itself. The atmosphere thrummed with anticipation, an epic showdown that threatened to challenge the authority and integrity of one of the most powerful judicial bodies in the nation. The narrative was about to unfold, revealing how Congresswoman Crockett meticulously and purposefully dismantled one of America's most influential and long-standing justices. This was a story that would capture the attention of the nation, exposing underlying biases and inconsistencies at the highest level of judicial power. Justice Samuel Alo had served on the Supreme Court for a remarkable 18 years. Appointed by then-President George W. Bush in 2006, he had earned a reputation as one of the court's most steadfast conservatives. At the age of 74, his salt-and-pepper hair, often complemented by his perpetual, slightly furrowed brow, had become almost an iconic image within legal circles, symbolizing his seasoned experience and unwavering judicial outlook. A graduate of Princeton University followed by Yale Law School, Alo had dedicated decades to the careful shaping of his judicial philosophy, which he claimed was rooted in a strict originalist interpretation of the Constitution, an approach asserting that the Constitution's meaning must be understood as it was intended by the Founding Fathers. Over the years, his judicial opinions had left a significant mark on American law, influencing rulings on a wide array of critical issues, from reproductive rights to religious liberties, always leaning toward conservative outcomes. Critics often accused him of cherry-picking historical facts and legal precedents, selectively interpreting the law to reinforce his personal ideological stance. Despite the controversies and debates surrounding his decisions, Alo had largely remained outside the direct glare of political controversy, protected by the tradition of judicial independence and the Supreme Court's reputation for insulated deliberation. It was only today that this carefully maintained distance was shattered by the fierce interrogation of Congresswoman Crockett. Standing opposite him was Jasmine Crockett, a rising star within the Democratic ranks and a formidable voice for progressive causes. At just over 43 years old, she had already carved out a name for herself as an unrelenting questioner. Her sharp, well-prepared inquiries were known to unsettle even the most seasoned lawmakers and judges. Her background as a civil rights attorney gave her a fierce determination and a meticulous approach to her work, qualities that she brought into the courtroom and congressional hearings with equal fervor. Her swift ascent within the political landscape was a testament not only to her intelligence and courage, but also to her readiness to challenge the status quo, especially when it came to defending individual rights and equality. With a law degree earned from the prestigious University of Houston and years of dedicated service defending those who are often overlooked or marginalized by society, Crockett brought a rare combination of legal expertise and personal gyeonghum to her role in Congress. Her professional journey, however, had been anything but straightforward or easy. As an African-American woman hailing from Missouri, yet forging her career in the state of Texas, she encountered countless obstacles and barriers along her path. Each challenge she faced only strengthened her resolve, shaping her into a fierce and unwavering advocate who was unafraid to confront those in positions of power directly and assertively. Her election to Congress in the year 2022 was not merely a personal milestone. It was a clear and powerful message to the nation. It signified that a new wave of leaders was emerging, leaders who would not be intimidated or silenced by long-standing traditions or the lofty status quo that often seemed resistant to change. These new voices were ready to question, to challenge, and to reshape the political landscape to better reflect the values and aspirations of an evolving society. The day of the hearing before the House Judiciary Committee was expected to follow the familiar pattern: ordinary, routine, almost predictable. It was meant to be a standard oversight session, a formal opportunity for members of Congress to pose questions to the justices about how courts were managed and about their judicial philosophies. Such hearings had traditionally been conducted in a cordial and respectful atmosphere, with lawmakers showing deference to these lifetime appointees, admirably experienced jurists who held immense influence over American law. Typically, most questions had been submitted well in advance, allowing justices to prepare carefully crafted responses and ensuring the proceedings moved smoothly. Yet, Crockett had deliberately decided to take a different approach. She was determined to make this session stand out, to challenge the status quo, and to hold the court accountable in a way that transcended mere formality. Over the preceding weeks, Crockett and her dedicated staff had meticulously examined Justice Alo's judicial record, scrutinizing every opinion, dissent, and public declaration he had made over the years. They had assembled a detailed document that highlighted perceived contradictions within his judicial philosophy, moments when his interpretation of the Constitution seemed to shift depending on the specific issue at hand. These inconsistencies suggested a pattern that could undermine the court's credibility, especially at a time when public trust was already severely shaken. The stakes could not have been higher, The Supreme Court's reputation was dangerously low, with record-breaking declines in public approval following highly controversial decisions related to abortion rights, voting rights, and presidential authority. Ethical scandals further eroded confidence, including revelations about luxurious trips paid for by private interests, dubious property transactions, and the political activism of some justices' spouses, all of which contributed to widespread skepticism about the judiciary's independence and integrity. For Justice Alo, this upcoming hearing represented a significant threat, an opportunity for credibility to be damaged or perhaps even permanently compromised. His carefully crafted image as a principled originalist, someone who strictly interprets the Constitution based on its original text and historical context, was now vulnerable. Any revelation of internal contradictions or inconsistent interpretations could not only tarnish his personal legacy, but could also undermine the legitimacy of some of the court's landmark rulings from recent years. The delicate balance he had maintained between defending his jurisprudence and avoiding controversy was on the verge of being tested like never before. Meanwhile, for Crockett, the risks of her questioning were just as substantial. Challenging a Supreme Court justice directly was a bold and risky move. Success could establish her as a principled and fearless defender of judicial integrity, putting her at the forefront of efforts to restore public confidence in the judiciary. But failure, or worse, being dismissed as merely a partisan agitator, could tarnish her reputation and weaken her influence. The line separating these outcomes was razor thin, and her effectiveness hinged entirely on her thorough preparation and precise execution during the proceedings. As she prepared to speak, Crockett's voice rang clearly in the chamber, projecting her message with calm authority. "Justice Alo," she began, her tone measured yet firm. "You have built your career and your reputation on the fundamental belief that the Constitution should be interpreted strictly according to its original text and meaning. You have frequently affirmed that rights not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution should not be recognized or extended unless they are deeply embedded in our nation's historical and traditional fabric." Alo, the justice, listened carefully, his face a neutral mask that revealed nothing of his internal thoughts. His nod was cautious, acknowledging her words without giving away any reaction.
She continued, "However, I have observed a pattern where this standard seems to be applied somewhat selectively, depending on the case before you. Today, I intend to examine that pattern in detail, because the American people deserve consistency from their highest court, a court they rely on to be fair, principled, and transparent in its reasoning." Crockett's meticulous notes were aligned before her, ready to guide her questions as she aimed to shed light on perceived discrepancies, holding the court and Justice Alo accountable for their interpretations and the principles they claimed to uphold. The atmosphere within the chamber grew tense as Justice Alito sat upright in his chair, straightening his posture as if to prepare himself for an impending challenge. All around him, the other justices exchanged glances, their expressions subtly shifting from neutrality to curiosity, understanding that what was about to unfold could deviate considerably from the ordinary, predictable hearings they had become accustomed to. The committee chairman, visibly uneasy, checked his wristwatch nervously, perhaps aware that this debate was reaching beyond typical procedural boundaries and into deeply contentious constitutional territory. With a calm yet firm demeanor, Justice Alito responded to the opening remarks, stating, "Honorable Congresswoman, throughout my tenure on this court, I have maintained a consistent approach when applying constitutional principles, regardless of the particular issue at hand." His voice was measured, controlled, yet an unmistakable hint of defensiveness lurked beneath his words. He went on to clarify, "The fundamental role of the judiciary is not to legislate from the bench or to create new rights, but solely to interpret the laws and the Constitution
as they are written. Now, Justice Crockett's lips curled into a subtle, knowing smile. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp and focused. "Then I trust you will have no objection if we examine some concrete examples," she said with quiet confidence. "Let's start by comparing your approach in the case of Department of State versus Doe, which overturned the previous ruling in Roe versus Wade, with your stance in other cases involving rights that are not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, but have been recognized through historical understanding." As she deftly opened a substantial binder filled with case documents, each page meticulously compiled, it became apparent to all in the room that she had come prepared, armed with irrefutable evidence and detailed records. It was clear from her confident tone and prepared appearance that this was a deliberate, pointed line of questioning. Justice Alito was about to be faced with an interrogation that could test the very limits of his legal reasoning and public image, arguably the most demanding confrontation of his judicial career so far. In the hearing room, Crockett's voice projected with a conviction that commanded attention, emphasizing her points carefully but assertively. She initiated the discussion by recalling that in the Department of State case, Justice Alito had articulated that rights not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, rights that are not enumerated, must nonetheless be deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition in order to be considered protected under constitutional principles. She then posed a direct question. In that decision, you concluded that the right to abortion was not sufficiently rooted in our historical traditions, and thus was not protected. Would you say that this is an accurate summary of your stance? Alito nodded silently, keeping his expression carefully guarded, giving no immediate indication of ease or discomfort. "Yes, Congresswoman," he replied, his voice steady. "The court's role is not to invent new rights or to extend protections beyond what the Constitution's text or its historical context permits. Rights that have not been historically recognized do not automatically merit constitutional protection." Crockett, not displaying any sign of being dissuaded, turned a page in her extensive binder before continuing.
"Let's now shift our focus to a different landmark case, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruen, where you notably joined Justice Thomas's majority opinion. That decision significantly broadened the scope of gun rights, recognizing a constitutional right to carry firearms in public." She paused briefly, allowing the gravity of her next point to resonate with everyone present. The opinion acknowledged an individual's right to bear arms outside the home, an extension not explicitly written in the Second Amendment, but derived from constitutional interpretation. Her gaze was fixed directly on Alito as she pressed further. "Could you explain why the court determined that the right to carry guns in public pages through your deeply rooted in history test, while, conversely, women's control over their own bodies, a practice long-standing in American history, does not meet the same standard?" A faint ripple of murmurs spread through the attending audience, judges, lawyers, and observers alike, reflecting the significance and controversy of the matter. Justice Alito, feeling the growing pressure, shifted uneasily in his seat. He leaned slightly toward his microphone, his tone adopting a somewhat defensive tone as he responded. "Those cases involve different constitutional provisions, each with their own historical background and context." He paused momentarily before continuing. "The Second Amendment explicitly protects the right to keep and bear arms, whereas no such explicit protection exists for abortion rights." Crockett nodded thoughtfully, seemingly willing to accept his explanation for the moment, but quickly moving forward as her eyes sharpened with resolve. "However," she argued, "the Ninth Amendment explicitly states that the enumeration of certain rights in the Constitution shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. Doesn't this clause imply that the founders anticipated that some rights, not specifically listed, should still be protected?" Before Alito could craft a response, she pressed on,
her tone steely yet articulate. Furthermore, if we look into historical records, evidence shows that abortion was legally permitted under common law in all 13 colonies until roughly the 16th week of pregnancy, known as quickening. Many of the founders' own medical textbooks included detailed instructions on performing early-term abortions. She paused briefly, her words deliberate, before the Chief Justice intervened, signaling that the line of questioning was entering a particularly sensitive and complex phase. This exchange illuminated both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the contrasting judicial philosophies at play, unraveling how the court's approach to interpreting historical traditions influences decisions on fundamental rights. The room remained silent for a moment, awaiting the next turn in this intricate legal dialogue, one that probed the very core of constitutional interpretation and the balance between tradition and evolving societal norms. Certainly. Here is a deeply elaborated and richly detailed reinterpretation of the original text, translated into English, carefully expanded and polished to be approximately 150 to 200% longer, while preserving the core meaning and facts. The courtroom was filled with an intense atmosphere as Congresswoman Justice Alo took the floor, meticulously articulating the reasoning behind the court's decisions in recent cases. Her explanation was precise, historically grounded, and reflected a deep understanding of legal principles. Yet, after outlining the principles that guided the court's reasoning, perhaps to steer the conversation toward a broader perspective, or simply to satisfy a desire for clarity, the interlocutor suggested a shift. Maybe we could move on to a different subject matter now, he proposed smoothly, aiming to guide the discussion toward new terrain. Crockett, who was keenly listening, responded with an equal measure of calm and curiosity. "Let me attempt to approach this from a different angle," he said, carefully pulling out another document, another piece of the puzzle, to shed light on the broader patterns. With deliberate motion, he presented a case in point. Turning towards Justice Alo, he addressed her directly. "Justice Alo, in the case of Carson versus Min, I observed that you supported a ruling that mandated taxpayer funding for religious education programs." He paused briefly, emphasizing the significance of that stance. "This is particularly noteworthy because such a position involves issues that were not explicitly addressed in the original text of the Constitution," Crockett explained. "Moreover, historically, this stance has been opposed by many of the nation's founding figures, including the influential James Madison." He paused to underline his point further, recalling Madison's own words, which condemned the practice of requiring citizens to financially support religious instruction as both morally wrong and potentially tyrannical. His voice conveyed a sense of respect for history, yet also a challenge to the consistency of the court's recent decisions. Justice Alo, attentively looking up from the document, nodded slightly, signaling her awareness of the issue. Crockett continued, "So, it appears clear that the test based solely on the historical roots of a law or principle, what some call the deeply rooted in history standard, was not applied in this case either. Would you agree, then, that this suggests an inconsistency, or perhaps an inconsistency in the way your judicial philosophy has been applied?" His tone was steady, aiming not just to question her reasoning, but to highlight what he saw as a potential flaw or contradiction. At this moment, Justice Alo's jaw tightened visibly, an involuntary sign of veiled vexation. The tension was palpable. That particular case involved the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, which carries its own jurisprudential prudence. Alo responded with measured but somewhat defensive tone. He emphasized that the clause's interpretation must involve careful consideration of long-standing legal traditions and historical understandings, an argument that attempted to justify a more flexible approach in that context. Crockett, undeterred, pressed on, seeking to explore the broader implications of Justice Alo's reasoning. "Let us then move to another example," he suggested, smoothly guiding the dialogue. In your concurrence in the Citizens United case, where you expressed support for the notion that corporations possess First Amendment rights, one might wonder about the consistency of such a position. He paused, allowing the audience and the court's members to reflect. Corporations, Crockett elaborated, are entities that were not explicitly recognized in the Constitution's text, nor were they considered persons with constitutional rights by the framers. Such a conclusion seems to stretch beyond the original meaning. To make his point more vivid and concrete, he reached for a visual aid, an elaborate chart displayed prominently on the large screens that surrounded the courtroom. This chart, Crockett explained, is a comparative visualization of roughly 20 of your judicial opinions. Each dot on the chart
signifies a case, with distinctive colors indicating the nature of your rulings.
The blue dots represent instances where you have adhered strictly to the text and historical context, thus limiting rights or interpretations based on what the Constitution explicitly states or what was understood at the time of its framing. Conversely, the red dots symbolize cases where you have expanded the scope of rights or interpretations, extending protections beyond what the original text or historical context might suggest. He pointed to the pattern emerging on the screen.
Notice, Justice Alo, what this distribution reveals, he prompted, highlighting the regions where the dots cluster. Many of the blue dots, those indicating restrictive or traditionalist rulings, are concentrated around cases involving voting rights, reproductive freedom, and criminal justice issues. Meanwhile, the red dots, those showing expansion of rights, are predominantly found in cases relating to religious liberties, gun ownership, and corporate rights. This visual presentation was designed to give a clear, immediate understanding of the court's internal dynamics. Yet, as Crockett finished describing, Justice Alo's composure visibly started to crack. His face grew paler, and his voice, initially calm, grew sharper as he objected. "This is a grossly misleading characterization," Alo countered suddenly and sharply, his words tinged with frustration. "It's an oversimplification of complex legal decisions, and I contend that such a visual does not accurately reflect the intricacies involved in these rulings." Crockett, maintaining his steady demeanor, responded with quiet confidence. "I have simply presented an overview of your voting record based on the cases on which you have authored opinions, or have been a significant part of. I am not yet making judgments, just showing data. However, since you brought it up, I'd like to ask a direct question. Do you apply different standards of constitutional interpretation depending on whether you personally agree with the rights or principles involved?" A gasp rippled through the courtroom at the audacity of the question, as such a direct accusation of potential bias against a sitting Supreme Court justice was almost unprecedented in legal history. Justice Alo's face flushed deeper red, and his voice thickened with annoyance. "That is an offensive question," he said sharply, "and a gross mischaracterization of my judicial record. I can assure you that I have always adhered to the same fundamental constitutional principles, regardless of the subject matter or my personal opinions." Crockett, sensing that he must be precise, nodded and pressed on. "Then perhaps you can clarify this apparent inconsistency." On the courtroom screen appeared a split image. On the left, a quote from Justice Alo's opinion in Dobbs v. Jackson. The statement, "The Constitution makes no reference to abortion, nor is such a right implicitly protected by its provisions." On the right, another quote from an earlier case, Berg v. California, where Justice Alo had expressed the view that the right to marry is essential to individual liberty and personal autonomy, even though marriage was not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution either. The juxtaposition was striking. It highlighted the contrast between his views on reproductive rights and his stance on same-sex marriage, raising an important question about whether different standards or principles are applied depending on the subject matter and personal convictions.
This deepened the inquiry into whether a consistent interpretative approach truly guides Justice Alo's judgments, or if, perhaps, personal beliefs subtly influence the court's decisions. The atmosphere in the courtroom quickly became charged with a palpable buzz of whispered conversations, as attentive spectators eagerly leaned forward in their seats, hanging on every word spoken by those participating in the intense legal exchanges. Several journalists, quick on their feet, hurriedly and diligently typed on their mobile devices, aiming to capture every significant quote and nuanced statement in real time, knowing that their reports could influence public opinion and the broader discourse surrounding this high-stakes hearing. Amidst the rising tension, Alito, a participant in this heated debate, responded with a voice that grew somewhat more assertive. He argued that certain statements had been misrepresented or taken out of context, emphasizing that the proper approach to constitutional analysis requires a careful examination of specific legal provisions, rather than focusing on isolated, potentially misleading quotes. His tone reflected confidence and a desire to clarify the complexity of constitutional interpretation. Countering him, Justice Alo Crockett, a figure known for his staunch defense of judicial transparency, asserted that he was deliberately providing the necessary context to understand the issues at hand. To illustrate his point, he retrieved a video clip from Justice Alito's confirmation hearings, highlighting a statement made back in 2006 where Alito affirmed that the Constitution applies equally to all individuals, affirming that no one is above the law. Yet, Crockett pointed out a stark contradiction. In the case of President Trump, Justice Alito had dissented from a requirement imposed on a sitting president to comply with a valid subpoena, effectively suggesting that the president could be considered above the law in certain circumstances. This raised the question of complex separation of powers, especially in situations where executive authority comes into conflict with accountability and legal obligations. At this point, Justice Crockett pressed further, shifting the focus slightly. He began to speak about Justice Alito's personal life, mentioning his wife, Martha Ann, whose political activism had become a matter of public record. Crockett noted that she had attended the rally on January the 6th and had made donations to political candidates who promoted the contentious view that the results of the 2020 election had been fraudulent and stolen. These actions, Crockett implied, could potentially influence the judge's rulings on related legal matters, an implication that crossed an invisible line of propriety. Justice Alito's professional composure, which had been unshakable until then, finally showed cracks. His voice, previously steady and controlled, now suddenly rose sharply as he snapped, declaring that his wife's activities were entirely her own and had no bearing whatsoever on how he reached his judicial decisions. He vehemently argued that bringing her personal political actions into this serious constitutional discussion was inappropriate and irrelevant, asserting that such matters should not influence or interfere with the independence of the judiciary. This prompted an abrupt intervention from the chairman of the committee, who struck the gavel loudly, signaling a desire to restore order and focus the proceedings strictly on matters related to judicial philosophy and the operational functioning of the courts. However, Crockett, with unwavering resolve, responded respectfully but firmly, insisting that questions about judicial ethics and potential conflicts of interest were very much within the scope of the oversight hearing's purpose. She turned her gaze back to Justice Alito, whose face was now flushed with a deep, unmistakable shade of crimson, indicating the intensity of his emotional response. The conversation swiftly shifted to another sensitive issue. Crockett directed her inquiry towards Justice Alito's personal conduct, referencing a photograph showing him at his residence, prominently displaying a large flag bearing the slogan, "Let's go, Brandon," a phrase widely recognized as a coded insult aimed at President Biden. Crockett asked how he could reconcile such a display with the core principles outlined in the first canon of the Judicial Code of Conduct, which explicitly requires judges to maintain the appearance of impartiality and neutrality in their public actions and demeanor. As soon as the question was posed, the entire room fell into a profound silence. all attention was fixed precisely on Justice Alo, whose breathing had visibly become more labored and strained under the weight of the confrontation. The Chief Justice leaned in slightly, whispering something to Alo, possibly offering counsel or encouragement, but Alo waved him off dismissively. When asked about the flag, Alo responded tersely that it had been put up during an ongoing dispute with a neighbor, implying that the display was a private matter and not indicative of judicial bias. He then added that the ethical guidelines outlined in the Code of Conduct did not formally extend to the Supreme Court, suggesting that the court operates under a different set of standards, less constrained by external ethical rules. Crockett, not deterred, pressed further with genuine curiosity, asking whether this acknowledgement meant that the Supreme Court functions with fewer ethical constraints than any other federal court in the country. Alo confirmed this, somewhat indirectly, by explaining that the court possesses its own internal procedures for handling conflicts, recusal decisions, and ethical questions. He cited specific examples, such as Justice Thomas deciding independently whether to recuse himself from cases involving his wife's political activities, or Justice Gorsuch failing to disclose property deals involving lawyers who had cases before the court, acts that raised genuine questions about transparency and impartiality. Crockett immediately interjected, emphasizing that these examples seemed highly relevant to understanding how different justices interpret and apply rules differently, depending on who is involved and what specific circumstances arise. Her words revealed a concern that such selective application of ethical standards could undermine public confidence in the judiciary's integrity. The tension within the room had escalated considerably by this point, reaching a breaking point, as the seriousness of the concerns, the disparities in ethical conduct, and the underlying issues of impartiality become unmistakably clear to all involved. During the tense proceedings, several members of the Republican side of the committee frantically signaled to the chairman, their gestures hurried and anxious, clearly indicating their unease and desire to intervene. The chairman, however, appeared increasingly uncomfortable, a soft flush creeping over his cheeks as he listened to the rapid-fire barrage of questions and comments. His facial expression conveyed a mixture of hesitation and reluctance to deviate from his initial position, yet it was evident that the mounting pressure was beginning to weigh on him. At that crucial moment, a member of the Democratic Party decided to speak up. The Congresswoman, who still had remaining time, articulated her points with calm authority, emphasizing that her line of questioning was rooted in legitimate oversight and aimed at clarifying the judicial reasoning. Her tone was measured, her questions pertinent and probing, designed to examine the nominee's stance and interpretative approach thoroughly. Recognizing her right to continue, the chairman reluctantly nodded, signaling for Crockett to proceed with her inquiry. Without delay, she turned her attention back to Judge Alo, whose composure, just moments earlier seemingly steady, now appeared visibly strained. The tension was palpable, and her questions aimed to expose inconsistencies or inaccuracies in his explanations. She posed a pointed question, the final one of this initial segment, addressing his frequent self-identification as an originalist, someone who claims to interpret the Constitution according to its original public meaning. Her tone was firm but respectful, as she pointed out that scholars have documented numerous instances where the judge's historical assertions contain significant errors or omissions. She held up a copy of a law review article, a peer-reviewed scholarly study, which identified 17 specific historical claims made in his earlier opinions, claiming that several diverged from the historical record. Among these was his assertion that abortion had always been illegal under common law, an assertion that, according to the study, contradicts the actual historical evidence. She asked how he would respond to the scholarly criticism, which argued that his historical use and interpretation appeared selective and sometimes inaccurate. At that point, Justice Alito's usual calm finally shattered entirely. His control over his demeanor broke as he slammed his hand forcefully onto the table, a movement so abrupt that it caused his water glass to tip over, spilling water across his notes and papers. His voice, which had been measured up until then, suddenly rose in a rising crescendo, almost to a shout, as he exclaimed, "This is nothing but a politically motivated attack!" His words echoed through the chamber, his voice elevated with emotion. "You're deliberately distorting my record to score political points. The Supreme Court deserves more respect than this partisan circus." This uncharacteristic display of emotion sent shockwaves through the room. The atmosphere thickened with surprise and tension as journalists present frantically captured the moment on their cameras, flashbulbs popping rapidly in quick succession. Photographers frantically clicked away, seeking to immortalize the rare outburst. Even the other justices, usually composed and reserved, appeared stunned by this sudden eruption of raw emotion, exchanging glances that betrayed their disbelief. The chairman responded swiftly, banging his gavel repeatedly to restore order. His voice, firm and commanding, cut through the chaos. "Order. We will take a 15-minute recess." The room immediately began to stir as staff hurried to clean up the spilled water, and attendees began to murmur among themselves, speculating and exchanging impressions of what they had just witnessed. Crockett, meanwhile, remained seated, steadfast and composed. She calmly organized her notes, demonstrating no outward signs of agitation. She had not shouted or raised her voice even once, yet she had succeeded in provoking one of the most powerful and esteemed justices of the country into a public breakdown. This moment marked the first phase of her strategic approach. Her calm, deliberate demeanor had effectively unsettled Justice Alo, causing him to lose control in front of everyone. The fact that he had succumbed so openly and visibly was an unambiguous demonstration of his rising emotional tension, and the room had witnessed his discomposure. This was a victory of sorts for Crockett's tactical patience and composure. When the hearing resumed, the entire atmosphere had shifted. The earlier tense, somewhat formal setting had transformed into a more charged environment, crackling with a new energy that hinted at something historic unfolding. The sense of anticipation was almost tangible, as if history itself was being written in real time. More members of the media, perhaps having snuck in during the recess or positioned themselves early, surrounded the room with their smartphones, angling their devices to capture every moment of what was now a highly scrutinized and scrutinizing spectacle, despite the committee's rules against recording or cameras. Judge Alo, during the break, had successfully regained his composure. His face, which moments before bore the traces of frustration and anger, now appeared once again as an impassive, typical judicial mask, calm, detached, and measured. Yet, a subtle tremor in his hand when he gracefully sipped from a fresh glass of water betrayed the lingering agitation beneath his composed exterior. His colleagues on the bench appeared less comfortable. Some stared straight ahead, fixated on their notes or the chamber walls, while others whispered quietly among themselves, exchanging subtle, anxious glances, perhaps contemplating the emotional outburst they had just witnessed, or the potential implications it might have. Crockett, meanwhile, returned confidently to her seat with an unwavering, determined stance. Her demeanor remained as composed and focused as it had been from the outset. If anything, she seemed even more intent, her posture straighter, her movements more deliberate, as she carefully resumed organizing her notes with a methodical, almost meticulous precision. Her calmness and unwavering focus during this emotionally tumultuous episode underscored her strategic purpose: to unsettle her opponent while maintaining her own composed exterior, ensuring that she remained in complete control of her part of the proceedings. The chairman cleared his throat softly, signaling that the session was about to resume. His voice, calm yet firm, addressed the assembled members of the committee. The committee will now come to order. Congresswoman Crockett, you may proceed with your questions. However, I must remind everyone to maintain the decorum befitting this formal setting. Her response was measured and composed, her tone presenting a respectful professionalism that commanded attention. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, she began, her voice steady as she framed her next words with careful intention. Justice Alo, I want to begin by expressing my apologies if any of my previous questions caused you discomfort or appeared to be confrontational. Please understand that my intent was not to provoke or embarrass, but rather to delve deeper into understanding how consistent and principled the Supreme Court's application of legal standards truly is. My concern arises from the need to ensure that the highest court in our land remains a beacon of impartiality and fair judgment. Justice Alo responded with a brief, measured nod, showing his readiness to face whatever might follow, though his expression suggested he was bracing himself for a challenging line of questioning. Crockett then shifted her focus, her tone now embodying a tone of genuine concern rather than confrontation. She stated, "At this moment, I would like to concentrate on what I believe is at the very heart of our current crisis. The American people's trust in the Supreme Court has plummeted to a historic low, just 27%, according to the latest Gallup poll. This decline in public confidence, this crisis of legitimacy, poses a serious threat to one of the foundational pillars of our democracy. It's a situation that demands our full attention." I will pause here, giving everyone a moment to reflect on the magnitude of these figures and the implications they carry for the stability of our governance. She regarded Justice Alo with a steady gaze, then posed a crucial question. Justice Alo, do you agree that maintaining the confidence of the public in the court's impartiality is essential for the court to function properly within our constitutional system? This framing of the issue was carefully chosen, leaving little room for denial or dismissal. It was an assertion rooted in the core principles that uphold the judiciary's credibility. Recognizing the potential trap, Alto responded cautiously, understanding that any indication of indifference to the court's standing could be exploited. "Of course," he replied diplomatically. "The legitimacy of the court is important. However, it is also vital to remember that judicial decisions must be rooted in law and the Constitution, rather than in temporary fluctuations of public opinion or polling data. Our duty is to interpret the law as it is, not as public sentiment might sway us." Crockett nodded in acknowledgement, her expression revealing a moment of surprise at the rare moment of agreement. "Exactly," she said, her voice firm. "The court's primary obligation is to follow the Constitution and the law above all. That is precisely why consistency in legal reasoning is so vital. It demonstrates that decisions are grounded in coherent principles and legal standards, not influenced by shifting opinions or partisan interests." Seeking to make her point even clearer, Crockett moved toward a display board that had been prepared during the break period by her team. It was a carefully curated visual aid featuring 2 columns of quotes, each sourced directly from Justice Alto's past writings and speeches. She pointed confidently to the left column. "All these statements originate from your own writings, Justice Alo." The left column shows instances where you have expressed skepticism about recognizing certain rights because they are not explicitly enumerated in the constitutional text. Her finger then moved across to the right column. "Meanwhile, these are cases where, despite similar textual absence, you have supported or expanded rights beyond what the original text explicitly states." The display was striking in its straightforwardness. It was a stark visual representation of apparent inconsistency, quotes from Alto himself that mutually contradicted each other, each supported with precise citations of the original judicial opinions. This made it impossible to dismiss the evidence as merely selective or interpreted out of context. Crockett's voice was steady as she continued pointing to specific examples. For instance, here you wrote that substantive due process has historically been a flawed and often dangerous doctrine, especially when used to deny protections for same-sex couples. She tapped on the quote. Yet here, in a different case, you invoked substantive due process to shield religious organizations from employment discrimination laws. Turning back to face him directly, she pressed further. The pattern appears to suggest that your approach to constitutional interpretation shifts depending on whose rights are at stake. It's a pattern that raises questions about consistency and objectivity. Justice Alo began to respond, perhaps to defend himself or clarify his reasoning. However, Crockett gently raised her hand, signaling her desire to control the flow of the conversation. "Before you answer," she said, "I want to make it clear that I am not casting doubt on your personal integrity or your good intentions. Everyone, including justices, can be influenced by implicit biases, those subconscious prejudices that affect us all at times." Her voice softened slightly, emphasizing her point. "But what is troubling, and is the very root of the legitimacy crisis we are witnessing, is when jurists apply different standards to different groups or issues, based not on consistent legal principles, but on subjective judgments. When this happens, the public's trust erodes, and confidence in the fairness of the judiciary diminishes. It's a challenge we must confront honestly for the sake of our democracy." This detailed discussion, which carefully acknowledged the importance of the institutional stakes involved in the issue while deliberately choosing to focus on documented inconsistencies rather than resorting to personal attacks, left Justice Alo with very few effective counters or rebuttals to the arguments presented. As the conversation progressed, the Congresswoman, addressing the court, began to speak with a tone that was tightly controlled yet increasingly tinged with a restrained frustration that was difficult to conceal. She emphasized that these particular cases involved a range of different constitutional provisions, each with its own complex history, legal context, and array of precedents established over the years. She pointed out that making direct comparisons based solely on isolated quotations, without considering the broader historical and judicial context, could easily lead to a distorted and misleading picture of the issues at hand. In response, Crockett, whose tone now shifted to a more instructive and patient clarity, reminiscent of a teacher explaining foundational concepts, declared that she would provide the necessary context to clarify the matters at stake. She moved toward an easel that displayed a carefully constructed timeline illustrating key moments in American legal history relevant to the debate. She began by highlighting that, in the case concerning restrictions on abortion, the advocate claimed that such restrictions were deeply ingrained in the nation's history. However, she emphasized that in the early years following the country's founding, abortion was legally permissible in every state until quickening, a point occurring roughly between 1,620 and 1,620 weeks of pregnancy, depending on regional practices. She further explained that the limitations and restrictions cited by the opposition primarily emerged during the late 1800s, specifically around the 1860s and the 1870s, a period when women lacked many fundamental rights, including the right to vote and serve on juries. Crockett's pointer traced the timeline along the display, illustrating these legal milestones vividly. Moving on to another case, she addressed the argument made in the case involving public gun carrying, where the court had determined that carrying firearms openly in public was rooted in long-standing tradition, primarily based on judicial decisions and norms established after the Civil War. The historical period in question was the same one that Crockett had dismissed as irrelevant in the earlier case concerning restriction of abortion rights. She pointed out that this apparent inconsistency was significant. The arguments relying on history in one context were accepted, while in another, similar historical evidence was disregarded or dismissed. The room, which had been quietly attentive, grew profoundly silent, with even Justice Alo's fellow justices observing the meticulous dismantling of his stated judicial principles and consistency. Justice Crockett then addressed the core issue with a firm but calm voice, emphasizing that the problem was not merely that Justice Alo was conservative in his judicial philosophy. She stated plainly and clearly that her concern was rooted in the fact that it appeared he applied history selectively, choosing only those elements that supported his preferred outcomes. Her words gained in strength as she spoke, her voice rising in conviction without needing to raise her volume, making her points with calm authority. She explained that rather than employing history as an impartial interpretative tool, some justices seemed to manipulate it to justify predetermined conclusions, often cherry-picking sources or contexts that suited their particular ideological positions. Returning gracefully to her seat, Crockett picked up another document, prepared to further her line of reasoning. She pointed out that many of Justice Alo's opinions relied repeatedly on citing historical sources, documents, cases, and references that had already been contested or questioned by reputable scholars in those very fields. For instance, she referenced Professor Mary Zagler, a well-respected legal historian specializing in reproductive rights, who had identified inaccuracies and misrepresentations within Justice Alo's opinion. When Professor Zagler publicly pointed out these historical inaccuracies, the justice in question dismissed her critique as mere political bias rather than engaging with her scholarship on its own terms. Crockett highlighted that, paradoxically, Justice Alo regularly cited non-legal academics whose views aligned with his own, yet dismissed or ignored the equally credible or even more authoritative perspectives of legal historians and scholars who challenged his interpretation. She noted that the court itself must ultimately decide what weight to give to historical evidence, with Crockett agreeing that it was indeed the court's responsibility to evaluate and interpret the relevant facts. However, she questioned whether that responsibility was exercised consistently across different cases. She observed that when the issue involved gun rights, the court tended to examine the historical record broadly and considered developments after the founding as relevant and legitimate. In contrast, when it came to abortion rights, the historical analysis was narrowed considerably, and similar forms of evidence were dismissed or downplayed. Her tone was earnest and genuinely concerned, not triumphant, as she leaned forward slightly and addressed the justices directly, seeking to underscore the importance of consistency in constitutional interpretation. She concluded her remarks by asserting that the American people could understand and accept a conservative judicial approach, one rooted in respect for tradition and precedent. What they found difficult to accept, she argued, was the appearance that some judges were engaging in reasoning that was primarily driven by results rather than principled interpretation. Such an approach, she suggested, undermined public confidence in the fairness and integrity of the judicial system. At this point, a member of the Republican committee interjected, attempting to challenge or interrupt her. He raised his voice, claiming that the congressman was unfairly badgering the witness and that he was making accusations rather than genuinely asking questions. Crockett, maintaining her composure, responded calmly, emphasizing that she was simply quoting Justice Alo's own words and decisions, which was a legitimate part of scrutinizing a judge's record. She pointed out that if reviewing a justice's public statements and opinions could be considered badgering, then meaningful oversight of the judiciary and ensuring accountability would become nearly impossible. The chairman hesitated for a moment, then allowed Crockett to continue her line of questioning. She turned her attention back to Justice Alo, prepared to further examine the discrepancies and inconsistencies in his legal reasoning, confident that her thorough and respectful approach would continue to shed light on important constitutional issues. Let me pose a straightforward question, one that cuts to the core of the matter. Do you honestly believe that your approach to interpreting the Constitution has remained consistent throughout various kinds of legal cases and across the diverse groups of Americans involved? Recognizing immediately that this is a complex and perhaps unanswerable query, I will acknowledge that it might seem to present a no-win dilemma. Nevertheless, I must clarify that my personal method has always been rooted in an unwavering commitment to understanding the Constitution by examining its text, its historical development, and its traditional meanings. Each constitutional provision deserves a tailored approach. What suffices for one clause might not be suitable for another. Therefore, I believe that different situations require different analytical frameworks. The context dictates the method of interpretation. Now, consider this. What if we apply the same constitutional provision in two different scenarios? Let's observe how the outcomes can vary dramatically, depending on the circumstances and the underlying principles at play. Duly noting this, Crockett then proceeded to illustrate her point by presenting two quotations from Alo, two statements that, visually, appeared side by side. She pointed out that in one case, he applied the Equal Protection Clause to policies concerning affirmative action, explicitly rejecting any consideration of racial factors. In a separate case, however, he relied on the same clause to argue against courts intervening in partisan gerrymandering, despite clear evidence of unequal treatment among voters. She then laid the document on the table, indicating that both examples involved the same constitutional provision, the Equal Protection Clause, yet the outcomes were strikingly different. The underlying variable, it seemed, was whose equality was deemed more important or more deserving of protection. The room remained silent as the methodical and precise critique continued, each word carefully chosen and supported by her evidence. This was not a partisan attack designed to undermine a particular justice, but rather a detailed, fact-based deconstruction of perceived inconsistencies in judicial reasoning, an examination based solely on the justice's own written words and opinions. Crockett, her tone now taking on a more earnest quality, addressed Justice Alo directly, her voice resonating with genuine appeal. She expressed her conviction that he cared deeply about the Constitution and the integrity of the judiciary as an institution. Therefore, she urged him to reflect sincerely on whether these apparent inconsistencies in his interpretations might be partially responsible for the ongoing crisis of legitimacy the Supreme Court presently faces. Alo sat stiffly in his seat, realizing that he had walked into a carefully crafted trap. To deny these inconsistencies would mean attempting to dismiss or explain away his own carefully documented words, an act that would be difficult to sustain without undermining his credibility. Conversely, admitting to these contradictions would threaten to erode the perceived legitimacy of his judicial prudence and, by extension, the court's authority. Silence stretched long and heavy after her challenging questions, the tension thick in the room as everyone waited for his response. After what felt like an unbearably slow pause, Justice Alo finally responded, choosing his words with noticeable care. He addressed Congresswoman Crockett directly, stating that he rejected the premise that his judicial reasoning had been inconsistent. He asserted that what might appear as contradictions to her arise from the inherently complex nature of constitutional interpretation, where legal analysis is applied across vastly different factual situations and legal contexts. He suggested that apparent contradictions are not necessarily indicative of inconsistency, but reflect the multifaceted and nuanced process of applying constitutional principles in real-world cases. Crockett nodded thoughtfully, signaling her acknowledgement of his explanation while also preparing her final line of questioning. She then presented a concluding, stark contrast displayed on a split screen. On one side, Alo's statement in the case of Dobbs versus Jackson, where he expressed that the right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions, and on the other side, his dissent in Obergefell versus Hodges, in which he argued that the Constitution leaves the question of same-sex marriage to be decided by the people of each state. Her point was clear and compelling. In Dobbs, he maintained that the Constitution prohibits recognizing rights that are not historically rooted. Yet, in Obergefell, he contended that the same document leaves the issue of marriage equality to the state's discretion. These two positions seem directly contradictory. Both cannot be correct simultaneously if they pertain to the same constitutional principles. She paused, allowing the contradiction to hang palpably in the air, emphasizing the inconsistency in his jurisprudence. Her conclusion was pointed. This pattern of reasoning appears less like consistent constitutional interpretation and more like a strategic attempt to achieve preferred outcomes, regardless of underlying principles, by choosing reasoning that best fits the desired result. The silence following this declaration was deafening, with several justices visibly shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Journalists, ever eager to record and analyze, frantically typed notes, knowing this exchange would likely echo in legal and political circles for a long time to come. Members of the committee, representing both major political parties, seemed completely captivated by the intense back and forth taking place before their eyes. Every word, every gesture drew their full attention, as if they were witnessing a pivotal moment in the history of American justice. After a tense pause, Alo finally broke the silence, his voice trembling slightly despite the effort he made to appear confident and composed. His tone carried an undercurrent of vulnerability, betraying the strain of the moment. He emphasized that constitutional law is inherently complex, a labyrinth of principles and interpretations that often defy superficial understanding. He pointed out that what may seem like clear contradictions on the surface frequently conceal subtle nuances, intricacies that cannot be fully grasped through quick quotations or brief summaries. In response, Crockett agreed wholeheartedly that constitutional law is not a straightforward matter. Her voice reflected a tone of respectful finality rather than ongoing confrontation as she addressed him. She asserted that this very complexity underscores why an inflexible approach, what is known as rigid originalism, has proven inadequate as a method of legal interpretation. The idea behind her words was that rigid adherence to the original intent of the framers, pretending to simplify the process, actually ignores the layered realities embedded within the Constitution. Sometimes, such strict literalism serves as a convenient cover for judges who wish to insert their personal preferences or political biases under the guise of legal interpretation. With these remarks, she gathered her notes neatly, signaling her intention to conclude her line of questioning. Crockett continued, stressing that the American people deserve Supreme Court justices who apply consistent rules and standards across all cases, regardless of the parties involved or the rights at stake. When the public observes their highest judicial authority applying different standards to different groups, it naturally cultivates doubts about the fairness and impartiality of justice itself. The notion of justice being blind, that is, unbiased and equal, is fundamental. If the public perceives favoritism or double standards, their trust in the entire judicial system diminishes. Turning her gaze directly toward Justice Alo, Crockett delivered her concluding remark with deliberate emphasis. She clarified that she did not question his sincere commitment to the Constitution. Rather, she questioned the consistency of his interpretive approach. Was his method truly rooted in the principles he claims to uphold? Or did he, perhaps unintentionally, alter the rules of engagement depending on who was involved? Her words implied that a justice who adapts the rules midstream, based on the identities or interests of the parties, undermines the very essence of the rule of law, something he, as a jurist, was supposed to defend and uphold throughout his career. Seeing that the moment had reached a natural conclusion, the committee chairman, sensing that the questioning had run its course, quickly called upon another member to continue. However, the damage had already been inflicted. In less than a quarter of an hour, approximately 15 minutes, Congresswoman Crockett had succeeded in systematically unmasking the contradictions embedded within Justice Alo's judicial philosophy. She did this by skillfully using his own words against him, quoting what he had previously said, thus turning his logic back on him. Throughout this process, she maintained perfect composure, her tone steady and controlled, even as she pushed him into an emotional corner, an uncommon and subtle victory in itself. Most remarkably, Crockett did not frame this exchange as a partisan attack designed to score political points. Instead, she presented it as a principled stand, defending the integrity of the judiciary and the need for consistent constitutional interpretation. Her approach underscored that her intent was rooted in upholding the principles of justice, transparency, and adherence to the rule of law, rather than partisan rivalry. As the focus shifted from Crockett to other committee members, it became glaringly apparent to everyone present that she had emerged victorious from this exchange. Justice Alo sat rigidly in his chair, his posture stiff, but his eyes betraying the fact that he felt the sting of defeat. Though outwardly maintaining a facade of calm, internally, he was visibly shaken. His carefully crafted judicial persona, associated with unwavering dignity and impartiality, was now publicly unraveled by his own words, his contradictions laid bare for all to see. The significance of this moment extended beyond mere political theater. It was a substantive victory that exposed the flaws in a jurist's approach, namely, a results-oriented mindset that masquerades as principled interpretation, but ultimately undermines the consistency and integrity of the judicial process. What had just transpired was not a superficial gotcha moment. It was a meaningful revelation of how the law can be manipulated when personal biases influence formal legal reasoning. All this unfolded on national television, watched by millions across the country. The image of a Supreme Court justice undone by his own inconsistent statements became a striking, unforgettable spectacle. The public, the media, and legal observers alike recognized that this was a rare instance where a high-level judicial figure was publicly challenged and exposed through nothing more than their own words and reasoning. The hearing wrapped up 3 hours later, but the true impact of what just happened was only beginning to resonate. As Justice Alo and his colleagues filed out of the chamber, their usual air of solemn detachment was noticeably tinged with tension. Their postures, stiff, their gazes directed downward or away, revealed that, despite maintaining external composure, they were internally affected by the confrontation. The historic nature of the event was immediately apparent to everyone present. It marked a significant moment in the ongoing narrative of judicial accountability. Outside the hearing room, an immediate surge of journalists and reporters converged on Congresswoman Crockett. Their eager questions and the flurry of camera flashes underscored how that single session had captured national attention, cementing her position as a symbol of principled questioning and judicial integrity. As cameras clicked and the flashing of photographic devices illuminated the room, microphones were thrust forward, capturing every word spoken. She stood there with a calm and unwavering expression, maintaining her composure under intense scrutiny. Unlike what some might expect in such confrontations, she refused to gloat or to frame the confrontation as a personal victory. Her demeanor was restrained and measured, emphasizing purpose over emotion. She made it clear to the gathered press in the hallway that the day's proceedings were not about scoring political points or achieving quick partisan wins. Instead, her focus was rooted in something more fundamental: the principle of constitutional consistency. It was about ensuring that the public's right to a fair and impartial Supreme Court remains protected, a court that applies the same timeless rules uniformly, no matter which issue is before it or which individual's rights are involved. Throughout her responses, she underscored her belief that the integrity of the judicial system depended on adherence to these universal principles, rather than on the whims or biases of any individual justice. When a journalist posed a question that seemed specifically crafted to generate a sensational headline, asking whether Justice Alo should consider resigning, she naturally pivoted. Her response was steady and deliberate, employing a tactful avoidance that avoided drama but preserved dignity. She replied that such decisions were not hers to make publicly, emphasizing her primary role: to ask the questions that matter most to the American people. She suggested that how Justice Alo personally reflects on their dialogue was a matter for their own conscience alone. This calm, balanced reply only served to heighten the resonance of her initial inquiry, making her stance appear principled rather than politically motivated. Instead of indulging in personal triumph or attacking her opponent, she demonstrated a commitment to integrity and a desire for genuine accountability. Her approach reinforced the understanding that her actions were driven by unwavering principles, positioning her oversight as a necessary safeguard rather than an incendiary attack. Meanwhile, the footage from this exchange was rapidly gaining traction across social media platforms, spreading at an unprecedented speed that surprised even the most seasoned observers. Short clips captured Justice Alito's rare display of emotion, an outburst that momentarily revealed vulnerability, juxtaposed sharply against Crockett's calm persistence and methodical questioning. Within mere hours, these clips amassed millions of views. Hashtags such as Alito words, Crockett courage, and Supreme contradiction began trending nationally, igniting conversations that extended well beyond the halls of Congress. The scene drew widespread attention, prompting a torrent of commentary from all corners of the political spectrum, with reactions often falling into predictable partisan patterns. Legal experts, scholars, and commentators weighed in with their interpretations. Notably, a number of conservative legal minds expressed unease, if only slightly, with the contradictions Crockett had successfully uncovered, a reflection, perhaps, of a shared discomfort with their own earlier certainties. For instance, Professor Hadley Richardson, known for her affiliation with George Mason University Law School, acknowledged that while she often agreed with Justice Alo's legal reasoning in many cases, the questions raised by Crockett deserved serious examination. Legitimate concerns about consistency and interpretive methodology, she remarked, are critical components of a healthy judiciary. These are issues that warrant thoughtful engagement rather than dismissive rhetoric. On the other hand, liberal legal commentators did not hold back. Harvard law professor Lauren Michaels, speaking on MSNBC, described the moment as reminiscent of the Emperor's New Clothes. She pointed out that Crockett had systematically exposed how the doctrine of original public meaning often functions as a cover for personal policy preferences, cloaked in the appearance of neutrality. Michaels argued that the entire exercise revealed how originalism, a foundational principle for many in the judiciary, was being wielded to justify predetermined viewpoints rather than honestly interpret the Constitution's original intent. By the evening hours, major television networks and news programs assembled panels of legal analysts and political commentators to dissect the day's events. On split screens, viewers could see the most compelling moments of Crockett's questioning appear side by side with Justice Alito's uncharacteristically emotional response. Some networks went further, attempting to frame the exchange in contrasting terms. Fox News, for example, characterized the hearing as an instance of disrespectful and aggressive questioning aimed at a distinguished jurist. Despite their attempt to cast the proceedings negatively, even their legal analysts found it difficult to dismiss the contradictions Crockett had highlighted, contradictions that Justice Alito had spoken into existence himself, using his own words. CNN's legal analyst Daniel Jacobson pointed out that the challenge for Justice Alito's defenders lies in the fact that Congresswoman Crockett did not attack him personally or attack his motives. She simply pointed out inconsistencies by quoting his own statements side by side. He explained that this approach was not a partisan tactic, but instead a form of rigorous oversight rooted in the need for clarity and accountability. The impact of this questioning extended beyond the legislative chamber, directly affecting the Supreme Court itself. Inside the court's hallowed halls, sources close to the justices reported that an emergency, informal meeting had been convened that evening, a rare occurrence altogether. During this clandestine gathering, the justices discussed the implications of the day's proceedings on the court's public reputation and its perceived impartiality. This session, characterized as unusual due to its informal nature, reflected the gravity with which the judiciary viewed the unfolding controversy. The concerns centered on how the public's trust might be influenced by the contradictions exposed and whether the court could maintain its authority if basic principles appeared compromised. The discussions lingered in the minds of many, signaling a moment of introspection for the institution and highlighting the fragility of its standing amidst an increasingly scrutinizing society. Although no official statements or formal comments were publicly issued in the aftermath of the event, those closely following the developments at the court recognized the extraordinary nature of what had just transpired. Witnesses and observers noted that rarely, if ever, in recent memory, had a justice been effectively cornered in the open setting of a public hearing in such a manner. The atmosphere surrounding the court, which often operates in a finely tuned, insular environment, where its rulings and opinions tend to pass largely unchallenged outside academic circles, was fundamentally shaken by this unprecedented confrontation. Margaret Sullivan, a seasoned observer of judicial affairs with many years of experience analyzing court proceedings, explained that in the regular course of business, justices are accustomed to speaking within a somewhat insulated sphere, where their statements and decisions are rarely subjected to direct scrutiny or aggressive questioning in public forums. However, the recent hearing breached that comfort zone, exposing vulnerabilities that will likely have profound, enduring ramifications on how the court approaches its public responsibilities going forward, including the formulation and presentation of written opinions, as well as its overall engagement with the media and the public. Meanwhile, the White House chose to adhere to a policy of silence regarding the incident. Out of respect for the independence of the judiciary, they refrained from issuing any official commentary or judgments about what had occurred. Despite this, sources close to the presidential administration revealed that the president was deeply interested and engaged in the proceedings, having watched extended video clips of the momentous exchange alongside senior advisors. This demonstrated a level of curiosity and concern from the highest levels of government, indicating that the confrontation had struck a chord at the very heart of the nation's political conscience. As the day transitioned into night, Justice Alo issued a brief statement to the press through the court's official communications office. The statement emphasized that the hearing involved complex constitutional issues that could not be sufficiently summarized through short sound bites or media snippets. Justice Alo reaffirmed his commitment to his judicial record, asserting confidence in the consistency of his interpretative methodology concerning constitutional questions. However, this succinct defensive remark served only to further ignite discussions, with many analysts interpreting it as a reflection of the tension and debate surrounding the substantive points that Crockett had raised during her questioning. By the next morning, the tumult surrounding the incident had spilled over into the front pages of major newspapers across the country. The New York Times led with the story that framed the event as a direct challenge to justice, highlighting Crockett's critique of Justice Alo's consistency in judicial reasoning. Meanwhile, the Washington Post chose to focus on what they described as a supreme contradiction, emphasizing that Alo's own words had come under scrutiny during the tense and emotionally charged hearing. Even the Wall Street Journal, generally seen as sympathetic to the conservative wing of the court, acknowledged the significance of the incident by pointing out that Justice Alo's prudence and judicial judgment were now under careful examination, especially in light of the heated exchange with a Congresswoman. Legal blogs, scholarly forums, and academic discussion groups erupted with detailed analyses of the controversy. Experts and law professors flocked to dissect the merits of Crockett's arguments, which pointed out contradictions and inconsistencies in Justice Alo's interpretation of the law. Many of these scholars announced plans to incorporate the exchange into upcoming constitutional law courses, viewing it as a compelling case study in judicial methodology and the ongoing debate over congressional oversight of the judiciary. The question remained, what was it about Crockett's approach that made her critique so potent and effective? Yale Law School professor Eleanor Wynne articulated that her strength lay in focusing not just on the outcomes of judicial decisions, but on the underlying methodology. Specifically, her pointing out that Justice Alo did not simply reach the wrong conclusions, but that he employed inconsistent methods to arrive at outcomes he may have predetermined. Such a critique strikes at the very core of judicial legitimacy, raising fundamental questions about the integrity and impartiality of judicial reasoning. 3 days after this dramatic hearing, a significant development stunned the legal community and the public alike. A respected law review, whose publication draft had already been in progress for some time, rushed to release a scholarly article online. The paper, authored collectively by 3 prominent legal historians renowned for their expertise in constitutional interpretation, was titled Selective Originalism: Historical Cherry-Picking in Supreme Court Jurisprudence. This peer-reviewed publication meticulously documented a series of historical inaccuracies, strategic miscitations, and cherry-picking of sources in some recent Supreme Court opinions, many of which had been authored by Justice Alo himself. The timing of this release appeared no coincidence. It seemed designed to amplify the ongoing dialogue sparked by the confrontation in the hearing room, and to lend scholarly weight and validation to the criticisms Crockett and others had voiced publicly. The article provided detailed analysis and extensive citations, exposing patterns of selective historical interpretation that undermined the claims of objectivity often associated with originalist legal philosophy. Its findings challenged the integrity of recent Supreme Court decisions, suggesting that certain justices, including Justice Alo, had engaged in a form of historical manipulation, deliberately choosing specific sources and narratives that supported predetermined legal outcomes. This revelation, coming immediately after the heated exchange and widespread media coverage, served to deepen the crisis of confidence in the court's interpretative processes and further fueled debates over judicial activism and the legitimacy of recent rulings. In essence, the ripple effects of that single public hearing extended beyond the immediate political and legal spheres, touching upon foundational questions about the integrity, methodology, and accountability of the judiciary in the modern age. The incident served as a stark reminder of the importance of transparency and consistency in judicial reasoning, raising pointed questions about how justice is served in one of the most powerful and influential branches of government. The scholarly community welcomed the law review article as a crucial step in fostering a more rigorous and honest debate, while the public grappled with the unsettling realization that the very foundations of judicial interpretation might be subject to selective bias and manipulation, issues that would undoubtedly shape discussions and reforms in the years to come. In the realm of media and public discourse, conservative outlets initially attempted to dismiss the recent revelations as merely a political stunt, a biased attempt to undermine the judiciary for partisan gains. However, the meticulous nature of the documentation, carefully gathered, rigorously compiled, and subjected to peer review, made it increasingly difficult for skeptics to dismiss the significance of the findings. The detailed evidence presented a compelling case that could not easily be dismissed as mere opinion or rumor, forcing even the most skeptical to reconsider their stance. Over the course of the following week, this story gained renewed relevance and momentum, capturing the attention of a broader audience and intensifying the national debate. The catalyst for this renewed interest was none other than Justice Elena Kagan, widely recognized for her pragmatic yet strategically measured approach within the Supreme Court. Known for her keen insight into institutional dynamics and her strategic engagement with the judiciary's role, she delivered a speech at Georgetown Law Center, an event already scheduled ahead of time, where she addressed themes central to the controversy, although without explicitly referencing the ongoing hearing or Justice Alito by name. Instead, her message was centered around the fundamental importance of consistency within the judicial interpretative process. During her speech before a gathering of future legal professionals, Kagan emphasized that the legitimacy of the court fundamentally depends on the public's perception that decisions are grounded in unwavering adherence to established legal principles rather than shifting personal biases or ideological preferences. She articulated that when the interpretive methods employed by the court begin to fluctuate based on the nature of the case before it, when the rules seem to change to fit political or ideological agendas, we erode that vital perception of judicial fairness and undermine the very legitimacy of the entire judiciary. Her words were widely interpreted by legal commentators and observers as a subtle yet powerful acknowledgement that the critiques put forth by Crockett, who questioned the court's consistency, had a solid foundation. Additionally, her remarks seemed to reveal underlying fissures within the court itself, exposing divisions that had been brought to light during the hearing. For Congresswoman Crockett, the hearing served as a pivotal moment that catapulted her into the national spotlight overnight. The immediate aftermath saw an influx of interview requests pouring into her office from various media outlets seeking her perspective, and her email inbox was flooded with fundraising requests, citing her courageous stance during the confrontation with Justice Alo. She, however, remained disciplined and steady in her messaging, consciously avoiding personal attacks or inflammatory language. Instead, she consistently redirected conversations back to the core issues at stake, namely, the consistency of judicial standards and interpretive methodologies, rather than allowing the discourse to devolve into personal or partisan conflicts. During an interview on the program 60 Minutes, Crockett reiterated her stance by stating that this entire controversy was not about her or Justice Alo, but about the fundamental integrity of the highest court of the nation. She emphasized that it was a matter of ensuring that the judiciary adheres to uniform standards, applying the same interpretive principles across all cases, rather than changing the rules in accordance with ideological inclinations. She explained that the American people deserve a judiciary that is consistent and impartial in its approach, and increasingly, they have come to suspect that what they are witnessing is the opposite, that the court's decisions are becoming more about partisan preferences than legal consistency. As the weeks progressed, the implications of the controversy grew more apparent and far-reaching. Law professors across the country started to notice a change in classroom dynamics, with students raising more pointed, penetrating questions about interpretive consistency and methodological rigor in constitutional law classes. Similarly, judicial nominees faced more sophisticated and nuanced questioning during their confirmation hearings, questioning that probed not only their judicial philosophies, but also their understanding of interpretive methodologies and consistency across various cases. Perhaps most significantly, the issue could no longer be confined to academic or media discussions. It began to surface prominently in the court's own opinions. Justice issued in rulings and concurring opinions increasingly reflected an awareness of the importance of interpretive uniformity. For example, in a concurring opinion issued approximately 2 months after the hearing, Chief Justice John Roberts made a notable statement. The court must be attentive not just to reaching the correct result, but also to applying consistent interpretive methods across different constitutional provisions and diverse types of cases. Our legitimacy depends on it. Although his statement was, on the surface, somewhat general and broad, it was widely regarded by legal analysts as an unmistakable response to the very issues Crockett had so effectively illuminated during the hearing. It signaled an acknowledgement from the highest levels of the judiciary that consistency in interpretive methodology was essential to maintaining public trust and legitimacy. For Justice Alo, whose conduct and responses during the hearing had come under intense scrutiny, this episode marked a significant turning point. While he remained an active member of the court, legal commentators observed subtle yet significant changes in his judicial writing and reasoning. His opinions began to show a more careful acknowledgement of counterarguments, a more thorough grounding in historical contexts, and, most notably, a more disciplined application of interpretive principles across a broader array of cases. These adjustments were seen as a direct consequence of the critical scrutiny he faced, which appeared to prompt a more reflective and consistent approach to his judicial reasoning. This entire sequence of events, often referred to by legal observers as the Crockett effect, demonstrated in compelling fashion how a proficient and strategic form of congressional oversight could influence even the most insulated and prestigious government institutions like the Supreme Court. Carefully avoiding rhetorical grandstanding or personal attacks, Crockett employed methodical, evidence-based questioning that focused squarely on substantive inconsistencies within judicial reasoning. Her approach illustrated the power of a well-organized, disciplined effort to hold the judiciary accountable, highlighting how persistent, substantive scrutiny rooted in facts and logic can shape even the most entrenched judicial practices. This episode served as a vivid reminder that judicial independence, while vital, is not impervious to diligent oversight and thoughtful challenge, especially when grounded in principles of consistency and fairness. In certain respects and moments in time, changes can be subtle yet profoundly impactful. Nearly half a year after her notable confrontation, Congresswoman Crockett graced a panel during the annual convention of the American Constitution Society, sharing the platform with several esteemed scholars renowned for their expertise in constitutional law. When questioned about the enduring influence of her exchange with Justice Alo, she responded with a balanced, deliberate perspective that reflected both humility and conviction. She believed that this particular incident had initiated an essential and necessary dialogue across the nation, one that sparked a broader discussion on how our judiciary interprets the law, approaches judicial methodology, and maintains consistency in its reasoning. Reflecting on the importance of her actions, she articulated, "The Supreme Court holds an extraordinary and far-reaching authority within our national legal and political system. With such power comes an inherent responsibility, a duty to uphold the principle of equal treatment by applying the same standards and rules uniformly, regardless of the specific issue at hand or the individual rights that may be at stake. When we observe discrepancies, inconsistencies, or double standards in decision-making, it becomes not only appropriate, but imperative for us, citizens, and especially those serving in Congress, to scrutinize and question these deviations." She paused thoughtfully, choosing her next words with care before continuing. "What gives me genuine hope," she revealed, "is that the core of this ongoing conversation transcends partisan divides. Both conservatives and liberals have a shared interest in seeing a court that adheres to consistent, principled standards rather than selectively employing interpretive tools that produce a desired political outcome. This is not a matter of political allegiance. Rather, it relates fundamentally to the integrity and credibility of our constitutional framework." Her remarks resonated deeply with her audience, who responded with a spontaneous standing ovation, not merely in recognition of her direct challenge to Justice Alo, but as an endorsement of her principled and articulate stance on what judicial review should embody within a democratic society grounded on the Constitution's principles. As the attendees gradually disbanded and moved toward the exits, two law professors lingered nearby, engaging in a quiet discussion. One of them observed quietly, "You know, it's truly remarkable. She never made it personal. Instead, she held up a mirror to Alito's own words and reasoning." The other nodded in agreement, adding, "And there's nothing more destructive to result-oriented judging than when a judge's own contradictions and inconsistencies are laid bare for everyone to see side by side." This exchange underscored a vital aspect of judicial critique, highlighting how exposing contradictions in judicial reasoning can be more damaging to biased interpretations than overt accusations or partisan attacks. The spotlight cast on her exchange with Justice Alo was not destined to be an isolated incident. Although Congresswoman Crockett would go on to make headlines on numerous occasions for her meticulous, evidence-based oversight and unwavering commitment to transparency, that particular moment remained unparalleled in its significance. It represented a turning point where a well-prepared legislator, armed solely with the words and reasoning of a justice himself, succeeded in reshaping the national discourse surrounding the Supreme Court's role and approach to constitutional interpretation. At its core, the confrontation was not simply about the ideological divide between conservative and liberal jurists. Instead, it was a deeper, more fundamental struggle between consistency and convenience, between unwavering principles and fleeting preferences. By revealing this distinction with such clarity and precision, Crockett bestowed upon the nation one of its most valuable services, holding those in power accountable to the fundamental principles they claim to uphold. Her courageous intervention exemplified an ideal of legislative oversight rooted in integrity, evidence, and respect for constitutional fidelity. In the months and years that followed, observers of the Supreme Court began to notice subtle yet meaningful shifts in its approach, an evolution rather than a revolutionary upheaval. Courts started paying increased attention to methodological consistency, striving to explain their decisions with greater clarity and acknowledgement of the complexities inherent in historical contexts. Judges and legal analysts became more aware that the public was now actively scrutinizing their reasoning, precisely the kind of contradictions and inconsistencies that Crockett had effectively exposed. This heightened awareness fostered a more transparent judicial process, making decision-making more accessible and accountable. This transformation was not a sudden shift. Rather, it was a necessary recalibration, a gradual move toward judicial humility and consistency aimed at reinforcing the court's legitimacy and public trust. Ultimately, these adjustments served to strengthen the reputation of the judiciary, affirming that the court's authority rests on principled reasoning, coherence, and adherence to the rule of law. In this way, Crockett's principled stand, challenging the status quo with facts and unwavering moral conviction, contributed significantly to a broader, ongoing process of judicial evolution. It reaffirmed that, in a constitutional democracy, the legitimacy of the judiciary depends not only on its rulings, but also on its willingness to reflect, self-correct, and uphold the foundational principles that underpin the American system of justice. It all started with a Congresswoman who arrived at the scene fully equipped, not with weapons or aggressive tactics, but with the sharp, deliberate power of the law and justice's own words. Her approach was carefully prepared, rooted in a clear understanding of the issues at hand, and wielded with precision to challenge authority and demand accountability. This moment marked the beginning of a notable political exchange, one that captured the attention of many who value integrity and transparency in governance. The scene unfolded as a dramatic confrontation between a figure of judicial authority and a determined representative of the people, each representing entirely different facets of public trust. The Congresswoman's demeanor was composed yet assertive, her arguments grounded in facts and legal principles, aiming to hold those in power responsible for their actions. Her preparedness and unwavering stance highlighted the importance of being well-informed and ready to stand up for what is right, even amid the pressures of political confrontation. If you found the intensity and significance of this political encounter compelling and thought-provoking, it is worth reflecting on the powerful messages conveyed through such moments. These instances serve as reminders that truth and justice can be articulated effectively through words, especially when delivered with conviction and deep understanding. They exemplify how individuals committed to accountability can challenge authority without resorting to hostility, simply by wielding the right words at the right moment. As we observe this historic exchange between Justice Alo and Congresswoman Crockett, it becomes evident how vital it is for citizens and representatives alike to prepare thoroughly for their roles. Such conversations are crucial as they embody the core democratic principle that the power ultimately rests with the people, and it must be exercised with discernment and courage. Moments like these serve as a testament to the strength of lawful argument and the enduring importance of accountability in maintaining a healthy, functioning democracy. Soon, we will be witnessing more instances of dedicated individuals standing up, questioning, and demanding answers from those in positions of authority. These ongoing stories of vigilance, transparency, and the fearless pursuit of truth are what keep the foundations of transparent governance firm and resilient. They remind us that, regardless of the challenges faced, those who are prepared to speak with conviction and integrity are the true guardians of justice.